Should you cram or use spaced repetition to learn Chinese vocabulary? Discover when each method works best and why spaced repetition is key to long-term success. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss reviewing vocabulary, and more specifically, we're going to compare two common methods for reviewing vocabulary, namely cramming and spaced repetition. Different listeners will have different reactions when I say that, so some of you might not be totally clear what spaced repetition is and how it's different from cramming, and for others who have listened for a while or just are generally aware of language learning methods, might think that spaced repetition is just better. I mean, you can almost hear that cramming is something you maybe don't want to do. But this topic is more interesting than I thought at first, and it is worth evaluating these two methods because they do have their merits, even though, like I said in the introduction, spaced repetition is best for long-term retention. But we'll get back to that later. First, let's talk about vocabulary and different methods for reviewing words and characters in Chinese. This is indeed one of the major problems when learning a new language, because there are so many words to learn, and if you don't review, you will forget most of what you have studied or encountered when you listen or read. Now, if you immerse yourself in the language and read and listen a lot, you will have reviewing built into your method, because if you read a lot, well, the same words will recur in different texts, and so you will review them automatically. And the same is, of course, true for listening. If pursued vigorously, this method will work on its own. You don't actually have to have a system for reviewing if you read and listen a lot. But most students don't do this, and they don't read and listen anywhere near as much as they need for this to work. It's also the case that the more advanced your Chinese gets, the more infrequent the words you want to learn become. And that means that you need to read an awful lot to learn these new words simply by osmosis. Furthermore, just because you can learn vocabulary simply by reading and listening a lot, this doesn't mean that this is the best method or the most efficient one. So you might want to combine it with some kind of active review. If we look at a specific vocabulary item, there are two ways you can structure your reviewing. So first, you can mass your repetitions together. So that essentially means that if you're going to review something, say 15 times, you do that in a row. The classic example here is to try to learn to write a Chinese character by hand, simply by writing it over and over. In the literature, this is normally known as massed repetition, and it is a form of cramming then, trying to squeeze all these reviews into a very short time span. I'm sure most listeners will recognize this because it is widely used in schools by students trying to pass exams. In contrast, with spaced repetition, you don't mass all your reviews together, but instead you space them out over time with a certain interval between each review. And in most systems, this review interval becomes longer with time. So for example, you might wait an hour before reviewing the second time, and then you might insert 2 hours until you review the next time, and then a day, then 2 days, 4, 8, 16, and so on, according to an algorithm which is more complicated than I let on here, but which basically extends the intervals longer the better you know something. The moment you forget something, however, the interval gets reset or at least reduced, so you have a chance to relearn that item. Spaced repetition is usually combined with flashcards, or at least that's the way most people think about it, but if you consider reading and listening, that is in itself a form of spaced repetition. There is a guest article on Hacking Chinese written by Kevin Bolloy where he explores and also provides some data to why reading and listening is actually more efficient than ordinary spaced repetition using flashcards, and I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. But let's use flashcards here to show how spaced repetition would be different than massed repetition when trying to learn to write a Chinese character by hand. So massed repetition, you just write the character over and over until you know it, let's say 15 times. But if you do the same thing with spaced repetition, then you write the, say, definition of this character on a piece of paper, or you have it on a digital flashcard, of course, and then you ask yourself, how do I write this character? And you write it. And if you get it right, you don't write it again immediately. You insert an interval between this review and the next. And as you get it right more times, this review interval will get longer until it's several months or even years. I have used spaced repetition software a lot when learning Chinese, and 15 reviews is quite a lot, and most vocabulary can be mastered in much less than 15 reviews. Whereas if you use up all these 15 reviews in one sitting, you stand almost no chance of remembering the vocabulary item long term. If you want to learn more about using flashcards for learning Chinese, you can check out episode 173, 175, and 176, where I discuss flashcards thoroughly from different angles. So based on what I've said so far, it might seem that spaced repetition is just strictly better than cramming, but that is actually not the case, and there are situations where cramming is actually better. Research also shows that students tend to rely on cramming more the further into their education they are. And if we were to say that spaced repetition is just better, does that mean that all students are just stupid and use the wrong method? Well, maybe, but maybe not. The thing is that cramming actually works better in the short term. So if you have an exam coming up, maybe cramming is the best method to prepare for that exam, not spaced repetition. In a way, I think this ought to be obvious, because spaced repetition is good because it's so efficient. You don't need to review many times to learn a lot of words. But that also means that the intervals between the reviews will grow longer, and so if you have an exam next week or maybe even next month, you won't even encounter the words that you want to review 15 times, whereas if you cram, you can certainly do that. It's up to you how many times you see them and when. One way of understanding this then is to say that cramming can be very effective, it gets the job done, but spaced repetition is always more efficient, meaning that you get more done per unit time that you invest. And if this difference is not obvious to you, I talked about the difference between learning effectively and learning efficiently in episode 124. So, like I said, if you have an exam coming up, cramming really works, and this is also why spaced repetition programs such as Anki has a cram mode. It's not just because users want it even though it doesn't work, it's because it actually does work in this specific context. And the context here is important, because institutional learning, and not just learning Chinese here, I'm talking about institutional learning in general, is generally speaking short-term. You have an exam, and once you finish that exam, you might move on to different topics, and you might not need to memorize these things long-term. Naturally, learning a language is a little bit different from learning some other subject in school, because when we say learn Chinese, we need to use the words we learned earlier on as we grow more advanced, whereas in some other topics you can really just move on to a different area. But still, courses are usually structured around tests, and the tests might not be structured in a way that require you to know everything that you've been tested on before, and so anything that works in the short term might actually be the smartest method if you want to pass your course and get good grades, that is. If your goal is instead to develop your language proficiency over time, well then cramming doesn't work all that well, but more about this later. There are also situations outside of institutional language learning where your goal actually might be short-term. Let's say you have a business meeting later this week, or you're supposed to interpret or translate something for someone at a specific event. Well, then cramming the vocabulary that's necessary for that specific task might be your best option. If you're going to use spaced repetition here, you needed to start much earlier than this week, and it might not be the best method in the first place. Another reason that students might rely more on mass repetition and cramming is because they simply lack the self-discipline to get started on time. And I'm sure most students have experienced this. You know that it would be great to start preparing for your exam a month ahead, because then you could really properly learn things so you remember them long term. But you don't do that for various reasons, and now suddenly you only have a few days, and then cramming is your only option. The final reason that students tend to rely on cramming is also the most interesting one, at least in my opinion. There is research to suggest that students underestimate the effectiveness of spaced repetition, and this is even when they have performed better with spaced repetition than they would have with massed repetition. For example, in a study by Cornell 2009, it was found that students who used spaced repetition did better than students who used massed repetition. But even after sitting an exam and having their knowledge tested, they still believed that massed repetition was more efficient, even if the test results showed the opposite. I find this result very interesting, and if I were allowed to speculate a little bit about the causes, I think there could be several things playing into this. First, it's common to mistake the ease of recall with your actual ability to recall something. So you might imagine then that if you review something 15 times in a row, you will be able to recall how to write this character every single time, and your sense of mastery of this character will increase. However, if you space your reviews out over time, you will sometimes forget the character, or when you remember it, you will have to think longer, and so your perceived mastery of this character might be lower than if you master reviews together. But as research shows, the difference is quite big in favor of spaced repetition here. The result is that if you space the reviews out, you will learn the character much better than if you mass them together. It just doesn't feel like that. This is a little bit similar to rereading a book as a way of reviewing the knowledge contained in it. So if you have a history exam, well, you just reread the text that you've covered this semester and hope that that will enable you to remember everything. But research shows that this is also a terrible method for reviewing. One final reason that students might prefer cramming is that it's easier to tick something off. For example, you can just go through chapter 15 and you can do so very thoroughly. You write all the characters over and over until you know them, and then you can move on. Whereas if you're using a spaced repetition program, it's harder to say that you're done with this chapter or check it off on a list. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and see what we've learned so far. First, we know that spaced repetition is more efficient in the long term, and it's not even close, whereas cramming can work in the short term, or indeed that might be the only option you have. We also know that institutional language learning tends to be short-term. We have exams you're supposed to pass, and learning the language is not one epic, super long journey, but rather something chopped up in many different courses, credits, and so on. However, unless your main goal is to get good grades, you should stick to spaced repetition because it's simply better in the long run, and learning Chinese is a very long-term project. It's not something you can do in months or even semesters. If you do care about grades, or indeed if you have some other short-term goal, nothing stops you from using cramming occasionally, but most of your vocabulary reviewing should be done through spaced repetition, either through vast amounts of reading and listening, or flashcards, or both. So even though it might look like, or sometimes feel like, cramming is a better method, it very rarely is, at least if real language proficiency is your goal. The reason cramming works is simply because that's the way our educational system is structured, and this is not a good reason to choose a study method. Before we wrap up this episode, I want to say a few words about what teachers can do to avoid students cramming. As I've argued in this episode, the reason that students cram is that the courses that we have and the tests that we give them encourage them to cram. So we need to stop organizing our teaching in a way that promotes cramming. Or to put it slightly differently, we need to structure our courses so that the methods that promote long-term success also work in our classrooms. Because, as I've already said, the goal is to learn Chinese, not to get a good grade. This means that we need to design courses and exams with long-term benefits in mind. We need to assess continuously, and we cannot just focus on things that have been learned recently, because then students benefit hugely from cramming, and most people will do that. If assessment also focuses more on students' ability to communicate, cramming a certain chapter in the book becomes much less useful than if assessment is simply, say, a dictation exam where you check if you've learned all the vocabulary from that chapter. Naturally, it's also important that students understand the short and long-term benefits of the methods that they use and the potential downsides of certain methods, such as cramming. They also need to be given the tools to succeed in the long run, and spaced repetition is one of those. For a complete list of references and further reading, please refer to the written article on Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.